Great. Well, thanks for joining Sierra Club California's Letter to the Editor training. Of course, my name is Michael Blenner. I'm the Communications and Digital Manager, and we're just going to jump right into it. So, give you a quick little table of contents, did our introductions. We're going to jump into what the basics of Letter to the Editor are, sort of what the difference between them and op-eds are, where you submit them to, etc., why they're important. So what the value is to our members and to our organization for you submitting letters to the editor, and then the best practices for how to write one. So without further ado, I'll go ahead and jump into the first slide. Great. So what is an LTE? So many of you probably already know this, but it's a letter to the editor. So a letter to the editor is a response to an article that's already been published in a specific publication. So we have an example from one of our members here, Ron Escaland, who's actually on the call. He is a member of our Zero Waste Committee. Last year, there was a bill that was being pushed through the legislature that was supporting chemical recycling, which is something that we're definitely not in favor of. There was a piece in Barron's, which is a business/finance focused publication, and we had Ron respond to that piece with the letter to the editor you see here. So obviously it's about a specific issue. In this case, it was chemical recycling, which the article described as a way to sort of solve plastic pollution. The article was a bit more sort of neutral, and Ron's piece rightfully, calls out some of the environmental concerns with this issue, some of the problems with existing chemical recycling facilities, and it importantly rebuts a lot of the points in the original article. So in this case, the article that Barron's published was missing some important environmental context, and Ron's letter to the editor was able to sort of fill some of Barron's readers in on that info, which was very valuable. So what is the difference broadly between letter to the editor and an op-ed? An op-ed, of course, is an opinion editorial. It'll usually be a couple hundred words, 500 plus generally, whereas LTEs will be usually 150 to 200-ish words. This example that I'm showing on the screen is about 124. An op-ed can really be about anything, any focus area, any coverage that you want to have in an outlet, whereas an LTE is, of course, responding to existing coverage in a publication. Obviously, in both cases, you want the LTE or the op-ed to be more sort of timely and newsworthy. But LTEs are specifically reactive, whereas op-eds can either be proactive or reactive. So responding to coverage or promoting your own points. Sometimes, an op-ed is a better format if you need more of a long form discussion. We recently did an op-ed on some local water issues in Southern California. But for the purposes of this training, we'll of course just be focusing solely on letters to the editors. So the origin of letter to the editors, which many of you from a prior generation may be familiar with, is actually physically sending in a letter to the editor of a newspaper. Nowadays, it's mostly done digitally, and the publications that primarily accept letters to the editors are still those sort of legacy print publications. So the LA Times, the New York Times, the Washington Post, etc., which are traditionally in print, but now are primarily digital. We primarily submit digitally because you get a quicker response time, you get a better chance of publishing. If you submit digitally, the majority of the LTEs that these outlets publish are submitted digitally. This is an example, the LTE that I have on the screen, of a national outlet that we had a response to, but typically we will focus on California-based outlets. Since they're local, it's easier to get coverage in there. They have sort of a lower bar than some of the national outlets. And a lot of the times the perspectives that our LTEs are putting forward are more relevant for that local coverage, that sort of community-based perspective. And obviously there's, sort of like a lower threshold for notable coverage in a local versus a national paper. Great, so that's sort of an overview of the basics of an LTE. Now we're going to jump into why they're important. So the first and most important reason is that you can help put out an environmentalist perspective on any specific issue. So again, in the Barron's example, the original article lacked some context about chemical recycling. And most of the outlets that we will send to, whether they be national or local, have sort of a generalist perspective on all of the news that they cover. So the way that the editors will look at any piece of coverage is what's the broadest way we can examine a story, what's the way we can tell a narrative that appeals to the most people, of course, because most of the places we're sending in LTEs to are not specifically climate or environmental focused publications. And sending in an LTE will potentially help us educate the readers of a specific publication about that environmental perspective, and potentially in some cases even get them involved in that issue on our side. So we've done letter to the editors in the past, which have helped sort of shift the tide or shift the perspective on important water conservation, other climate issues. So there's a lot of value in getting them into local, national, whichever kind of paper, and getting your views and the views of the environmental community more broadly out there, because reaching the audiences of these outlets has value in and of itself. May shock some folks, but politicians do indeed read. Politicians, regulators, local community groups. They will see these letter to the editors. They'll see how the coverage has shifted, see how people have responded, and importantly, they'll see these power brokers that constituents care, and it does actually influence their decisions. This is the reason we do our action alerts, why we have folks call in to legislators and regulatory bodies. And that's another important reason why we primarily target local papers, because these decision makers will see that their constituents, that their local population are changing their minds on an issue, and that shifts how they're going to approach any prospective decision that they're going to make about policy. And when we work with our members on an LTE, we can help promote it through our social channels. We can help push it out through our email lists, help spread the idea essentially to other environmentalists, and really push the word out as much as possible about we're fighting back against this issue, or we're trying to get this important pro-environmental bill passed, or what have you. And importantly, it can also in some cases influence an outlet's editorial coverage of a specific issue. So a publication will see folks are responding to the way they covered a certain issue, they're sending in LTEs, they're making comments, and it will change how they cover that issue in some cases. The editors obviously have to get a sense of public opinion, and when public opinion shifts, it shifts their coverage. And that has a snowball effect of when the coverage changes to be more pro-environment, to be more inclusive of pro-climate, pro-environment perspectives, it can change public opinion as well. The people that read these outlets are going to understand that folks are interested in this issue from another perspective, and that's also very important. And it can also, an LTE, shine a spotlight on sort of what environmentalists are doing around any particular issue. To reference the Barron's example again, instead of chemical recycling, we should be doing X, Y, and Z, or we should be promoting this other solution, or what have you. Just to hop back up to the LTE, Ron mentioned NRDC, the National Resources Defense Council, in the first couple sentences, which is one of our partner organizations. And, people see NRDC is mentioned, they potentially see Sierra Club is mentioned, and they say, oh, maybe I heard of this organization before, maybe I didn't know anything about them, but I see that they're, advocating on this environmental issue. And, it matters that they are, or we are, or any environmentalist is calling out whether it's sort of misinformation or disinformation, in that case from, the big plastics industry, shows that there's ways to get involved that can help bring people into our tent and show that there's ongoing work on a topic, which has a value in and of itself, bringing people into the fold who might not have been aware of our work already. And the question of, how you want to approach identifying yourself when you write the LTE is, I think, a case-by-case basis. Ron is, of course, not mentioned as a Sierra Club volunteer in that text that we sent. Whether or not you want to identify yourself is, I think, matters based on the context. Sometimes it can have the benefit of giving you sort of expertise. Even if you don't reference that you're working with Sierra Club or NRDC or whomever, you can say, I've worked on these issues for decades, or I've been involved in the fight against plastics, or I've been involved in this conservation effort for my entire life, or what have you. And it gives your opinion some credence. Also important for local outlets specifically is mentioning, you're a local citizen. I'm a concerned person living in this area who's affected by this issue, and it matters to me that, whatever outlet, it matters that the Union Tribune, the LA Times, whatever, is covering it from this perspective and making sure you're including that local angle in the coverage. So that, again, does matter to some of the editors who will be reviewing your letter to the editor. So that's the value in writing an LTE. So now I'm going to jump into the best practices for how you can write and pitch an effective one. Great. So the first thing is identifying a story, a piece of coverage where you can present a unique and environmentalist perspective about an environmental or climate issue. So whether it be plastics, whether it be composting, we've done LTEs on water issues, we've done LTEs on any issue that the environmental movement touches on that you specifically are passionate about, and Sierra Club can help you with that, is a great opportunity to write a letter to the editor. And then once you find a potentially good story to respond to, the first step is reaching out to your local chapter for help. And importantly, we want to stress making sure that the ask that you make to the chapter is timely, as LTEs generally don't get published until a few days after the story comes out, sometimes as much as a week. So we want to move as quickly as possible. You want to let us know there's a story that I think would be great for me to respond to. We'll get started, helping you figure out what the messaging is. Ultimately, you write it, we'll help you edit it. We can give you some tips to pitch it and sort of shape, okay, we want to promote this alternative or highlight this problem with the article, some facts that they left out, some context that they didn't include, and they should be focusing on this instead, or they should, make sure in the future to cover this story in this way. So when actually writing an LTE, important to remember you only have a couple hundred words, so you want to make your point as quickly and clearly as possible. So I'll jump up one more time to the Barron's LTE so you can see. Ron identifies the story, he promotes an alternative view, and then gives evidence for that view, all within the first 2 sentences. And that's because obviously an LTE is very short, and the editors who review them do so at a very rapid pace. So you want to make sure to get all the information front-loaded as to why this LTE should be published, why the specific outlet should care. So explain your perspective, and specifically why you're writing the LTE can also be very valuable. So, whether you're formatting it, you want to consider, what is the point of me specifically writing about this? Do I have something interesting to say? Do I have any kind of individual expertise that the outlet will be interested in? do I know something that maybe the editors didn't include? And really shape the narrative that you want the LTE to say and how you want it to sort of respond to the existing coverage. And for getting it published specifically, there's a different submission process for every outlet. So for instance, the LA Times is, I believe, 150 words, the Chronicle's 200 words for their different guidelines, but you always want to make sure that you include your name, your city of residence, contact info, when the article appeared you're responding to. And if you have a title, or again, if you have any kind of background in the area, that can also be helpful to include. As I mentioned before, there are submission forms on most websites that accept LTEs. So there's a couple examples here. Obviously, the LA Times, the Chronicle, the Bee, the OC Register, all accept LTEs. You can also email the editor directly. Some outlets have an LTE editor and or opinion editor who oversees that coverage. And just making sure that you are keeping up with whatever their specific type of format is important, because you want to submit something to the LA Times, it's going to be different than how you submit it to the Union Tribune or what have you. And again, we can also help with that process, but ultimately you're going to be the one to hit send on it. And the editor is going to review what you send them. So important to make sure everything is packaged up all nice and neatly. And once you send it off, then we just, we hope and we give it our best shot. And hopefully you get a letter to the editor pushed out from that coverage. So great, that was about all the presentation I had for today. We're going to go ahead and stop recording.